For many leaders, addressing performance issues is about as appealing as getting a root canal. You know that you need to, but the process of doing it is just not a happy experience. If you relate, great news, today's episode is just for you. Hello, Difference Maker, and welcome to IDD Leader, the podcast that's all about helping IDD providers retain and grow their DSP workforce using behavioral science. I'm your host, Nate Beers, and today I'm going to talk about how to address performance issues. This comes up over and over again in leadership and often causes a lot of stress for those involved. Hopefully by the end of today's episode, I believe you'll be feeling much more empowered to handle this or get a nice refresher course for those of you that are just acing this over and over again. Let's start with a story that's an iconic moment from the movie Home Alone. Now listen, I've got 7 kids, and hold on, yes, I said that right, 7 kids, on purpose, by the way, yes. And so I watch a lot of children's movies, and one of the movies I've seen many, many times over is Home Alone. Well, there's this iconic moment where the two thieves, Marv and Harry, they're upstairs in Kevin McAllister's house, and the boy Kevin had just put a tarantula on Marv's face. He screams, he shakes it off, and it lands on Harry's chest. And Marv is holding a crowbar, starting to pull it back over his head, while this spider, this tarantula, is sitting on Harry's chest. He doesn't realize it's there, and he's looking up at Marv. He's going, "Marv, what are you doing, Marv?" As Marv is winding up, and then thwap, he swings that crowbar very hard down, trying to get the tarantula that was sitting on Harry's chest. He misses, and of course, this makes Harry very angry, and it's a slapstick scene of comedy. That moment mimics something that I have seen in addressing performance issues far too often. And we will revisit that story in just a couple moments. Now, as I was prepping for today's episode, I was thinking for a few minutes about approaching it from a personality perspective. Granted, I'm not about to leave my behavioral roots, but it was fun to think about for a minute. I mean, come on. We could do it like this. We've got the different styles of how to address performance issues. In the indirect camp, you've got the beat around the bush approach or the candy coat approach. You know, everything's going great, you're doing so great, there's this little problem here, and then you just keep talking really nicely, and the next thing you know, the person that's getting addressed with a performance issue has no idea what was just said because it was just overly sugar-coated. Or beating around the bush, it's like a 30-minute conversation about everything that's going on except for the issue that needs to get addressed. Or, also from the personality perspective, you could have the direct camp. You've got the huff and puff approach. These are the folks that just get really intense. They tap into that anger and frustration over what their team member is doing, and they let them have it. You could think kind of just, hopefully, I'm sure someone popped in your head. Hopefully there's not too much trauma from that. But yeah, we've all been around someone that did that. Or you've got the I'm calling it an airstrike approach. This is the one that has sent an email up the chain, so it's not just, the boss is telling them, but they've linked in their boss and the boss above them, or they call them in for a meeting, and, like the CEO, the entire board is sitting there to tell them that they need to show up on time to work, or something like this. They're calling in the airstrike because they don't want to get and do the work themselves. Anyhow, we could kind of go bananas with this, just talking about the different styles. But let me at this point just cut to the chase. I want to give you a framework on how to approach this topic, how to address performance issues. And today we're targeting more of the lower level, like I'm not going to fire you today kind of issues. Those would take a little bit of a different approach if it's that serious, and probably your HR department is going to almost certainly be involved in that. And if you're in more of a director role, these are the ones where you often get pulled into because whatever was tried at the lower level doesn't work. However, many of the bigger issues that arise started as small issues, and so much more common are addressing these smaller performance issues. Without further ado, let's get into it. How do you do that? Well, the very first thing I would characterize with this phrase, having self-management. If you are a leader of people in any capacity, it pretty much just comes with the territory, which is to say, before I go into any kind of talk where I'm going to be addressing a performance issue, I actually want to make sure, am I currently being triggered or upset or really frustrated? Because I'm not going to be nearly as effective if I'm reacting emotionally. I'm also double checking with myself, is this truly a performance issue, or is this just something that annoys me or bothers me? And kind of just that check-in. I don't know if this is something that you do on a regular basis, but it has saved me worlds of trouble, which is just sort of checking in with myself, making sure that I'm managing me before I am ever going to try to manage someone else's behaviors. Making sure I'm managing myself. That actually can save some people. Maybe they were raised with one of those like a loud family where they just yell a lot or things like that. It's very ineffective manager style. So self-management looks like making sure I'm keeping me in check before I even move forward at all. Making sure I've done whatever background thought or research, or I don't mean research on it in a book or an internet. I mean just really looking at, is this person going against a policy or going against the culture we're trying to build? Just being clear on what is the problem. And that leads right into the second thing, which is define the problem, the performance issue, in terms of observable behaviors. I'm not going to address someone about having an attitude problem because it's really hard to fix an attitude problem. Wait, how they're thinking and seeing the world, and I mean, how does someone go about fixing an attitude problem? As soon as you start to tell them the specifics on how to do it, you're going to start getting into the observable behaviors. If this was someone that's greeting people at the door as they're coming into a day program and they are frowning, being short with people, or if differently than that, if they were on their cell phone, distracted, those, you could say that's an attitude problem, but really we would just want to define the behaviors. Don't be on your cell phone. Pay attention to what's going on around you. Greet people with a smile. Whether or not you're having a good day, help them have a great start to their day here at our day program, and so on. We want to define it in terms of observable behaviors. And then we want to communicate this. When we first approach the person we're going to talk to, we want to very clearly communicate early in that conversation. We want to say, hey, I've noticed this, and then we just say the observable behavior. I've noticed that you are doing such and such. A quick note on this. If it's one of those lower level things, this doesn't always need a sit-down meeting, and sometimes that's not going to be best at all because then the defenses and the guards are going to be way higher. Sometimes it's just like, hey, can I talk to you for a sec? Just pull them aside, ideally close to the moment of it happening, and then just going right into it right then and there. Thirdly, we want to move quickly from communicating the observable behavior to then asking questions. Don't fill in the blanks for them. Instead, ask things such as, help me understand what was going on when you, and then the observable behavior. Help me understand how you think arriving on time is going. Help me understand how it's going. Let's suppose that you're a higher level manager and you're addressing a supervisor that keeps having issues on their team. You can ask, help me understand how our team dynamics going. I've observed that you seem stressed out and that you're firing off emails where it looks like maybe there should be conversations. Help me understand, what's your experience of this? I love that phrase, help me understand, because it literally helps me get in the right frame of mind for where I'm hoping some of this conversation goes. Another follow-up question to that can be, how can I help you? And then fill in the blank. How can I help you? How can I help support you? This goes right back to our story. Oftentimes, this happens in conflicts in interpersonal relationships as well, like in marriages or families, but it happens between managers and their direct reports a lot, where we put the problem in between us, or we see that spider and we see it's on that person. The first thing I said, right, we're defining the issue in observable behaviors. So we're trying to start to separate. It's not that we need that person to be a different person. We need some different behaviors. That's metaphorically like getting the spider off of that person. But then what we want to do is we want to come, and instead of standing opposite of them, we want to come alongside them, and we can be looking at that tarantula and saying, we got to get this thing dealt with. And we're going shoulder to shoulder. How can we solve this? How can I help you solve this? Now, it might be theirs to solve, but still, just that shift in that language and that shift in approach of saying, this thing over here is a problem, or we have a standard that you're not hitting. I want you to hit this standard. I want to help support you hitting this standard. So that we're not positioning that person is the problem, and that we just don't start swinging things. Because as soon as we approach a situation with that kind of an attitude or that type of a mentality where this person's got to stop, and we're going to make them stop, it's a little bit like we're lifting up that crowbar, and they're looking at us, and all kinds of stuff is going off probably in their head, and they're not going to be very receptive to that. And so those two simple behaviors, help me understand, fill in the rest of it, and how can I help you, fill in the rest of it, really helps us shift where instead of being opposite, where that problem is smack dab in between us, and we are going to be taking shots at the problem, maybe getting each other as casualties in the process, to then it gets us shoulder to shoulder with the other individual. Now, I'm not saying step down from your role as a leader. I don't mean it like that. But simply, how can I as a leader help support you in your efforts to address this issue? The next step, we want to assess. Sometimes we can do this before. A lot of times we're going to get this by having a conversation with them and asking some questions. We want to assess, is this an issue of skill versus will? In other words, does this person have the skill but they're not displaying it? And that would be the will. I think I said this backwards. Does this person not have the skill? If they don't have the skill, then they need to get trained. They might need to get mentored. If they have the skill but they're not doing it, we're calling that an issue of will, then we want to adjust the contingencies, the if this, then that. If you think of this is a completely different type of example, but simple, basic classroom management, the stereotypical class clown, they crack the joke knowing they might get in trouble with the teacher because it's so rewarding to have everybody in the class laugh. At workplaces, sometimes people engage in behaviors because it feels good, or they get this social praise for doing things, or they're dealing with a side situation that feels more urgent in their personal life, and so they're carrying that into work and different things along these lines. But if they're not getting, if you continue to do this, then you're going to experience this thing you don't want to experience. That's like the negative version. Or the positive version is, if you engage in these best practices, then you're going to be moving towards these rewards, which I dive into on another episode. Even just recently, I talked about that. I think it was on the previous episode from this one, depending on when these exactly get released. However, I'm not going to go real in depth on that right now, but we can set up contingencies so that it impacts motivation or their will, using that rhyme of the issue of skill versus will. There's just a little bit more left on this. Next, we want to create a very clear contingency such as this. It would sound something like this. I need A by time frame B in order to C or else D. I need you to show up on time, not late, for your shift every day for the next 2 weeks. It will need to go longer than that, but for the next 2 weeks, in order to value your teammates, ensure that the people that are supposed to be getting off of their shift can get off of their shift, make sure everything keeps running properly. Or else, we're going to move on to a very formal corrective action plan involving HR and this is the kind of thing that someone could end up losing their job over, which I don't want that to happen to you. So I need A by time frame B in order to C or else D. If it's the very first time you're addressing someone, you might not need to go quite as formal as that sentence or that part of the conversation. Sometimes just a quick little, hey, I noticed this is happening. Help me understand. They share with you. Please make sure it stops happening. For high performers, for some of the stronger teammates, usually that's all that's needed. You don't even have to go quite as clear as that. But as soon as you realize there's some kind of an issue where it's not just that they don't know how to, but they're choosing otherwise kind of on purpose, that's where you're going to want to have that type of put together a paragraph or sentence along those lines to make it really clear what's going to happen if they continue on that path. And then one more aspect I want to talk about, or one more step as you're going through this, and this kind of is going to bridge the gap between a less formal conversation to where it starts to need to get more formal. But it's really worth talking about for a moment here. There's two levels when we're addressing performance issues. And sometimes we never get to level 2. Level 1 is that I'm communicating with the person that's on my team. Such and such behaviors need to change. Now, if I've had that conversation more than 2 times, hopefully I don't have to have it more than once. But let's suppose I've had it twice, and now I'm seeing that same problem is arising again. Before I finish what I'm about to say on this, I want to share with you that this is a pretty big sticking point at a lot of levels in a lot of organizations. If you have heard either in your company or this can happen in your personal life, you hear someone complaining about somebody else repeatedly, but the issue's never gotten addressed, then you know that this is what's happening. Maybe it's been talked about, but it's not. There's no consequences. Nothing is changing, right? We are just hitting the same problem over and over and over again. Then at that point, I would say we have a second level or level 2 that's happening, which is it's not just that I need the person to change their behavior that has to do with the performance, but I also am starting to realize I need them to be able to respond to feedback. They need to be able to make changes based on conversations that we have. And if someone's not being responsive, trust usually starts to erode very quickly because I've already had this conversation. I shouldn't have to have it again. Yeah, it can start to grate on people. It can start to raise the frustrations. But even more than maybe that, it feels bad or it feels frustrating, is the trust erodes. And so if I'm hoping to have this person stick around, which if they're generally doing well, but there's one problem area, then yeah, I want them to stick around. Then I not only need to tell them and communicate, hey, this problem is still a problem, but I also need to bring the conversation and say, and also I've addressed it with you on this day, and I'm still not seeing the changes. So, and I want to be able to trust you to make changes based on our conversations. And usually right around the time that you're getting there in a performance issue, it's important to start involving whatever your HR policy or whoever gets involved with creating corrective action procedures and things along those lines. In other words, talk isn't working. And maybe you didn't say the consequences clearly, so they need to be spoken very clearly, but probably things are going to need to start getting in writing right around this time. And even more than just having that procedure in place in the general sense, because I've seen people that have corrective action plans in place, but then they still, that just keep dragging their feet to actually execute. But this is where, by the time I'm having the same conversation with someone a third time, a lot of the time I'm thinking they're probably not going to turn it around. Or I'm questioning, did I ever really make a new contingency, any kind of an or else statement? And that's where we want to bring in HR. We want to bring in whatever corrective action procedure in place so that they get it very clear. This has to happen by this time frame in order for you to keep working here, or else you will not be working here any longer. And it's kind of your shape up or ship out. But oftentimes I've seen it, and especially in human services, because we are often very compassionate people that are in this field. We're rooting for people. we're just ready to adopt not only our clients or the people we're serving in that way, but oftentimes our staff. Oh, we want it to work out for them. We're trying to make it work. I've seen that more often than kind of your like just quick to fire them. Get the Queen of Hearts from Alice in Wonderland. Off with their head. I've seen that occasionally in human services, but more often I see kind of that overly compassionate / enabling poor behaviors approach. And so if you've had to address it 2 times informally, immediately go. For number 3 has to be starting to be formalized. And the conversation isn't just the problem of whatever their performance issue, but it's the lack of change. And frankly, that's actually becomes the bigger problem, is their inability to make the changes. Now, again, with the right support, intervention, and with clear consequences, they might very well make those changes. Some people don't respond until they're right at the edge of that cliff. However, we want to expedite that process and not let this thing just drag out over and over and over again. If I were to leave you with one action item for this day, for this episode today, I would say this. If there's anyone, not just on your direct team, if you're overseeing supervisors, but especially as you're coaching and helping other supervisors or other managers, if they've got people on their teams, certainly it's true if it's on your team, if someone's on their teams that they keep having the same performance conversation with, help them move to action with clear timeframes and clear consequences, that it doesn't just keep dragging out. I've seen organizations get bogged down, and good people will leave if their colleagues are allowed to act poorly over and over again without consequence. Right? One sour apple can ruin the whole batch. You don't want to lose your good apples, so make sure you're dealing with your sour apples. If you found this podcast helpful, would you think about paying it forward? Listen, you could hit the share button and you can message this to that friend or colleague, maybe it's even your spouse, who's been complaining to you about the same person on their team over and over again. Seriously, stop listening to them complain and just give them the tools to help solve it. Or you could also pay it forward by rating or reviewing this podcast on whatever platform you are listening to. That helps other people to find it. Well, until next time, here's to you, difference maker. Keep up the amazing work.